Okay, last panel before lunch. My name is Maya Starcevic. I teach at Windward School, and it's my great pleasure to present the panelists for the Culture Shock panel, Work Exploring Literature of Social Critique. Although I do feel like pretty much everything we've heard up to now was also literature exploring social critique. But okay, so please welcome Eva Weiss from Buckley. She's going to get us started. Then we'll go on to Matthew Lurie from Windward, and then Juliana Yablans from Crossroads. I'll give it over to Eva.
Beautiful. Quote, everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. Crimson-faced, empty-handed, and ready for death. Billy Pilgrim is stripped down and has nothing to give. The war has broken him. Coping with the horrors of war and murder is nearly impossible. In Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, Billy Pilgrim caused death, and in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, Sue Kidwell discovered it. Billy and Sue cope with these first-hand horrors by turning to the pursuit and creation of beauty. Sue enrolls in college to study art, and Billy invents the beautiful society of Tralfamadore. Beauty serves as an escape from the barbarity of violent death. The person who experiences the horror is the most traumatized. However, in Cold Blood, the Clutter family were the victims, and they are dead. Therefore, we do not know anything about their experiences because they were the only ones present during their murder other than the murderers. Sue discovered the butchered dead bodies of her dear friend, which makes her the next most traumatized person in this situation. Naturally, she needs a coping mechanism. When Alvin Dewey, the leading investigator on the murders, meets Sue in the cemetery and asks what she's up to, she says, quote, everything. Art, mostly. I love it. I'm really happy. Turning to art is Sue's way of coping with the murders. Not only has Sue turned to art to deal with these horrors, but she has also escaped the town in which they took place. Quote, but you know Holcomb. Actually, I don't spend much time there. Sue has learned to avoid Holcomb because it is where the tragedy occurred. This is unfortunate because Holcomb is known as a place where, quote, you won't find friendlier people or fresher air or sweeter drinking water. I figured there's no better place to raise kids than right here. Placid residential streets where animals and children are safe to run free. In order to be happy, Sue's focus, both geographical and mental, is elsewhere, at the University of Kansas where she studies art. Art is the epitome of beauty, and the opposite of what Sue experienced in Holcomb. Billy participated in a horrific war, and to make matters worse, he was totally unprepared. Quote, he had no helmet, no overcoat, no weapon, and no boots. On his feet were cheap, low-cut civilian shoes, which he had bought for his father's funeral. Billy had lost a heel, which made him bop up and down, up and down. Dealing with the war in general is difficult. However, dealing with the war when you are unprepared puts you at an even bigger disadvantage. Not only was Billy unprepared, but the climate was extremely harsh. Quote, wind and cold and violent exercise has turned his face to crimson. Coping with these horrifying circumstances seems virtually impossible. All of this is too much for Billy. So to cope with the horrors of the war, Billy creates an alternate reality where he can survive. Billy calls his new reality Tralfamadore, a planet inhabited by Tralfamadorians. Billy says that he is captured by these aliens. Quote, he said, too, that he had been kidnapped by a flying saucer in 1967. The saucer was from planet Tralfamadore, he said. The notion of being taken away by these mystical, otherworldly figures separates Billy from the reality of death. Being kidnapped by fictional aliens is his escape mechanism. Nancy Clutter was known in Holcomb for her beauty and talent. Quote, the town darling, Nancy. Nancy was the epitome of health, youth, and beauty. When Mr. Helm, the housekeeper's husband, warned her that she would get a cold after getting splashed with water, quote, Nancy laughed. She had never been ill, not once. Nancy even saw herself as the idealized version of a young beauty. Being attractive was important to Nancy. She was a star on the stage and a star in the kitchen. She often cooked for her family when her mother was not able to do so. Quote, either he or Nancy, but principally Nancy, prepared the family meals. When she was murdered, her youth and beauty were taken with her. Dewey is reminded of Nancy's beauty when he sees Sue, her best friend. Quote, a pretty girl in a hurry, her smooth hair swinging, shining, just such as a young woman that Nancy might have been. Dewey, after Sue, is the next most exposed to the brutal killings of the Clutter family. He was the leading sheriff, quote, "It was inevitable that Earl Robinson, the sheriff of Finney County, should ask Al Dewey to take charge of the Clutter case. Finding the beauty in Sue as a reminder of Nancy is Dewey's way of coping with Nancy's death. He uses beauty to deal with the gory murder of Nancy Clutter." The undertaker allows Sue and Bobby, Nancy's boyfriend, to view the family. Sue is completely disturbed at the sight of Nancy in her dress of cherry red velvet. She takes note of the attire of the whole Clutter family and is particularly shaken by the fact that each of their heads was encased in cotton. Despite this horrific sight, and obviously to cope with its horrors, Sue's mind wanders to a more pleasant time when she helped Nancy pick the material for the dress. Quote, "All I could say was Nancy's red velvet, and Nancy dancing in it." Even though Sue was looking at the freakish dead bodies of the Clutter family, her mind focuses on the beauty of the dress and the memory of Nancy during a happy time. Her mind automatically distracts the horrible view and goes to a more beautiful time. Billy creates the planet Tralfamadore to cope with the war. He was so damaged from the horrors of war that he truly believes that this fictional planet is real, and worse, that he has traveled there. The Tralfamadorians advise Billy to, quote, "concentrate on the happy moments in his life and to ignore the unhappy ones. Stare only at pretty things as eternity failed to go by." The Tralfamadorians instruct Billy to only look at the beauty in things and to completely disregard the negative. This further distracts from the tragedy he has encountered. Tralfamadorians see in 4 dimensions, meaning that they see in all moments in time at once. Quote, "The creatures were friendly, and they could see in 4 dimensions. They pitied Earthlings for being only able to see 3. The Tralfamadorians teach Billy that when someone dies, they are only dead in that moment. They are alive in other dimensions and periods of time. The Tralfamadorians compare this philosophy to the Rocky Mountains, a beautiful landscape used to describe death. Quote, "The Tralfamadorians can look at all the different moments just as the way we can look at a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, for instance." Billy turns to something beautiful to deal with the ugliness of death. He creates the Tralfamadorians and their beautiful philosophy on death to cope with the reality and horror of the killings he witnessed and committed in the war. Beauty only acts as a distraction to what both the murders in Holcomb and the atrocity of war has caused. Physical beauty is superficial and does not change the finality of death. Although Sue says she is happy and immerses herself in beautiful art, the reality is that she was a witness to a horrific and shocking murder. She found her best friend dead and mutilated in her home. The beauty of the art she is studying does nothing to minimize this horror. The fact that the murders of the Clutter family happened in this beautiful, quiet, idyllic place was initially surprising to the townspeople. In reality, the beauty of a town has nothing to do with its safety. In fact, this may have put people in a false sense of security and led to their demise. Similarly, Billy Pilgrim's Tralfamadorians and their beautiful philosophies do not bring back the lives lost in the war. Despite his creation, Billy greatly suffered and was close to death. Although it does provide an escape from the reality of death, the death still remains. Nothing can change that.
How do you work this? Oh, there we go. Okay. Hi, so my name is Matthew Lurie. I am a senior at Windward School, and my essay, this one, Kafka, the Fortune Teller of Genocide, analyzes how Kafka's work, Metamorphosis, is in fact a prediction of genocidal regimes that occur years after his death. So just a quick overview. In this presentation, I will first cover some background information, such as who is Franz Kafka, just a quick summary of Metamorphosis, and then also talk about Milan Kundera. I used him as a secondary source. And then I will get into my argument, first talking about allusions to future genocides within the work, and then getting into whether the perpetrators of the crime in Metamorphosis were denying their involvement or simply not responsible. And then finally, I will discuss whether the novella is really a prediction of future genocides. And just a quick warning, this is about genocide, so there may be some disturbing content. Sorry about that, but it's the way it is. Okay, so Franz Kafka, he was born in Prague. He's a German-speaking Jew, or was a German-speaking Jew, and therefore he was a minority in the primarily Czech city. Additionally, the city was governed by German ruling party, so therefore he faced kind of like a double oppression, and this comes out in his work a lot. Metamorphosis, he wrote it in 1913, and basically it's a story about a guy named Gregor Samsa, who is a businessman, and he's worked hard to support his family, and one day he randomly wakes up and he's a human-sized cockroach. And then the rest of the story pretty much talks about the transformation of the family dynamic from Gregor being a valued part of the family to him being treated as vermin. And finally, Milan Kundera, he is a Czech-born French writer. And I use this work somewhere behind as a secondary source. A quote from this work is, Kafka succeeded in creating an image that fascinates us by its resemblance to a society he never knew. So his argument, which with that I based my essay on, is that Kafka did predict the society that we live in today in his works. So finally we can get into the essay itself. So in this paper I will argue that Kafka's work is in fact a prediction of atrocities that will occur years after Metamorphosis was written. And while this may seem unlikely due to the fact that Kafka never experienced anything like this during his time, I still believe he was able to anticipate these events based on his experiences as part of the Jewish community and based on past historical events. So classification and dehumanization, you're probably wondering what that is. So nearly every genocide from the 20th century to present day, there's been a certain set of steps that lead up to the eventual killing. And one of the earliest steps is classification of different groups of society. So in Metamorphosis, this occurs when Gregor transforms into a cockroach. His family starts to treat him as an outsider, and an example of this is when his sister, Grete, enters his room to feed him. She tiptoes in as if calling upon a grave invalid or even a stranger. So Gregor is no longer treated as a member of the family, but an undesirable stranger, just because of his transformation. Additionally, in a different situation, Gregor's father is chasing him around, and Gregor thinks he should remain on the floor for the time being, because he is afraid that if he took to the walls or ceiling, his father might interpret this as a sign of particular wickedness on his part. So he realizes that his family is treating him differently because of this transformation, and he does not want to continue to perpetuate this oppression. He understands that if he continues to act like a cockroach, his family will forget that he ever was human at one time. And this leads to the next step, which is dehumanization. This is one of the most crucial steps in a genocide, as it allows the oppressing party to commit the atrocity. And I found a parallel between the dehumanization in Metamorphosis and the Rwandan genocide, which happened decades after. In this genocide, the genocidal Hutu government used radio to spread hate propaganda, such as comparing the Tutsi ethnic groups to cockroaches. And if we could play that, a little bit of that. That's probably good, thanks. Awesome. Okay, so as you can see, by comparing the Tutsis to cockroaches, the Hutus extremists were able to dehumanize the Tutsis in the eyes of the general public. And this way, when the killing started, the general public both allowed the extremists to get away with it and even in many cases turned on their friends and neighbors and aided in the killing. And similarly in the story, Gregor's sister Grete tells her father, "We must get rid of it," and it being Gregor. You have to put from your mind any thought that it's Gregor. And this is a blatant attempt at dehumanization that would eventually lead to the extermination stage. And at this point, the oppressing party would find a way to get rid of the victim group. And in the novella, Gregor eventually dies of starvation and infection. Oh. Spoiler alert. So the next segment is denial or not responsible. So Gregor's death leads to the question whether the family is in fact responsible or if it was just an accident. I believe that they were responsible, and this is an example of the denial stage of a genocide, which is the final stage. And in this stage, the genocidal party would find a way to either cover up the crime they committed or blame it on the fog of war. And an example of this in the real world would have been the Guatemalan genocide. In this genocide, there was a small Mayan rebel force that tried to lead a coup against the government, and the government used this as an excuse to perpetuate a genocide against the entire Mayan population, ultimately killing like thousands of innocent men, women, and children. And this is a very similar situation to where Mr. Samsa blames Gregor for making Miss Samsa faint. Mr. Samsa supposed that Gregor had perpetuated some act of violence, and he roared, in a tone equally enraged and delighted. He raised his feet to an uncommon height. So much like in the Guatemalan genocide, the oppressing party, the father, exaggerated the threat of the victim group, which was Gregor, in order to perpetuate violence against him. So is this really a prediction? While it may seem I'm reading way too much into this story, the imagery Kafka invokes through Gregor's living conditions, which can be described as very concentration camp-esque, say otherwise. While he is somewhat fed and cared for, Gregor is kept locked away in his room the entire novella, and he's even forced to live for weeks with a rotten apple embedded in his back. So by the end of his life, he's living in absolute filth. He was fed food he cannot eat, and he's not given vital medical treatment. And this is a nearly identical description to the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. Additionally, in the end, when the narrator is describing Gregor's dead, emaciated body, it is very evocative of the starving Jews in the camps. So, conclusion. Well, I don't have any other slides, but right now you may be thinking, even if Kafka's prediction was relevant at some point, the novella was written over 100 years ago, and we have international laws now to prevent this kind of stuff. While people, including myself, want to believe this society is too civilized for events such as the genocide nowadays, these events are still occurring today. Right now, in the Middle East, ISIS is perpetuating a genocide against various religious groups, including the Yazidis and the Christians. Additionally, even here at home, we have events targeting specific religious groups, such as the recent desecration of Jewish cemeteries and various executive mandates seemingly targeting followers of the Muslim religion. Unfortunately, Kafka's prediction is as relevant as ever, and unless communities come together in a way such as this to finally abolish the hatred, this pattern will continue. Thank you.
So does this just go like this arrow?
Yes. If you go to the next slide, it's just like your name.
Okay. So hi, I'm Juliana Blons, and I'm a junior at Crossroads. So 11th grade at my school focuses on American literature and what does it mean to be American and how does American literature reflect the people of the United States. So, there we go. Okay. So after finishing our first book, we read 4 short stories from the 20th century and then followed with the American classic, The Great Gatsby. As usual, what follows a novel is an analytical essay reflecting a theme or motif in the book. So our task was to pick one of the 4 short stories and compare it to Gatsby. I chose Ernest Hemingway's Indian Camp and compared it to Fitzgerald's novel, answering the question, to what extent does The Great Gatsby live up to or fall short of the archetype of the modern era set by Indian Camp, a time where tradition was rejected in favor of new sensibilities? So, The Great Gatsby and Indian Camp are two very different stories in plot. The Great Gatsby, as a lot of us know, is the story of ultimate wealth and betrayal during the summer of 1922. And Indian Camp, on the other hand, is a dark tale about the brutal birth of an American Indian. So, although they differ very greatly in plot, both stories reject romanticism, industrialism, and absolute truth, all rejections of characteristics of the time before the modern era, solidifying that these two stories are representations of this period. So, Indian Camp specifically. So, Hemingway's story holds many motifs that represent a modern America. The story of the gruesome birth of the American Indian, where tools like fishing wire and knives were used, rejects the pre-modern concept of romanticism, a time where relationships and the goodness of humanity were found in nature. Indian Camp also focuses on the aspect of loose ends. Modernists did not trust the idea of absolute truth, and in his story, Hemingway purposefully conceals the identity of the father, embodying a motif of the modern period. And although Indian Camp was published years after the American industrialization, the approach to the mother's care dates back to the Stone Age. The doctors traveled by a dimly lit boat and used a brutal approach to the birth, rejecting industrialism, a time of technological and cultural innovations. So the motifs and symbols in Indian Camp, romanticism, industrialization, and loose ends are also very present in The Great Gatsby. But I'm going to skip over this slide just for time because it's also not very relevant. So going straight into The Great Gatsby. So Fitzgerald's use of nature in Gatsby symbolizes the separation from the traditional romanticism of the 19th and 20th centuries. So while talking to his gardener, Gatsby sets up the scene of his death to follow. So the first quote is that scene. So Gatsby's unplanned and casual longing to swim, initiated by the seasons changing, inspired him to connect with the natural world, a very romantic aspect. But by tying this action in with tragedy, the tragedy of death, Fitzgerald completely rejects romanticism. Romantics valued this connection, yet in a scene where Gatsby finally connects with the earth, he ends up drawing his last breath. And then the next quote is when Nick describes what he thought Gatsby was thinking at the time of his death. A rose, one of nature's most beautiful creations, is grotesque to Gatsby because it represents everything that he isn't, a real creation with substance, unlike Gatsby, who surrounds himself with materialism and a fraudulent lifestyle. So, along with romanticism, Fitzgerald's use of loose ends are left untied throughout the whole plot. Specifically, the first quote, on a night in Manhattan, Nick ends up in the apartment of Mr. McKee, a friend of Tom and Daisy's. So, Fitzgerald implies that Nick and McKee had some sort of sexual encounter, emphasized by McKee's wardrobe choice and the name of his paintings, suggestive sexual connotations, like Beauty and the Beast, loneliness. And then, again, throughout the novel, Nick prides himself on being the most honest person he knows, direct quote. And he describes Jordan Baker, his former girlfriend, as very dishonest. Nick calls her a bad driver in the beginning of the novel, encompassing all of her bad traits, from cheating in golf to lying to her friends. And by having Jordan call Nick a bad driver as well, Fitzgerald hints that Nick might not be as honest as he describes himself. Again, he declines to answer this any further, leaving the audience questioning the honesty of the narrator throughout the entire plot. So, along with rejection of absolute truth and romanticism, Fitzgerald also rejects industrialization through the life and death of Myrtle Wilson. So, Nick describes Myrtle, Tom's mistress, in a really negative and critical light throughout the novel. Myrtle lives in the decaying Valley of Ashes, representing industrialization between West Egg and Manhattan, the two very modern aspects of the story. But by assigning her the role of mistress, someone lower in class and morals than any other character, describing her also with no beauty, Fitzgerald in turn criticizes industrialism. Myrtle will never be able to reach the modern beauty of West Egg and is stuck in the purgatory of ashes. And then again, Fitzgerald further rejects industrialism when Daisy kills Myrtle. So Daisy, Gatsby's lover, Tom's wife, is pretty much the ultimate modern character of The Great Gatsby, living a life of modern beauty and unnatural morals. By having the ultimate modern aspect of the story kill the industrial aspect, Myrtle, Fitzgerald shatters any link between the two eras. Through Myrtle's life and death, Fitzgerald conveys that the industrial era ultimately succumbed to the greater modern period, signifying that The Great Gatsby is a tale of this period. So, whenever I finish my essays, I like to think, why does this matter? Why do we care about what I'm writing? Why do I care about what I'm writing? So, to answer this question, we must look at what the modern period allowed Fitzgerald and Hemingway to do. Both authors were able to criticize society around them. It allowed them to break away from traditions and grow from their pasts, along with America's past. No matter how one looked, despair and anguish lied within both the plots of Hemingway's and Fitzgerald's stories. But with that despair came the freedom to speak against society and the past, an action that can give anyone who takes hold of it the greatest of hope. Thank you.
Okay, great. We have some time for questions now. Okay.
This is especially for the first two presenters, but what do you and the authors you talk about think cause humans to commit atrocities such as war and genocide, and do you think they are inevitable?
No, but I will. Do you want to go?
It's a hard question.
Okay, I'll go. Well, I can speak for myself, but I think that genocides are caused by hatred, obviously, and much of this stems from religion, and unfortunately, that's not going to go away anytime soon, if ever. But genocides are preventable, especially if they're caught early, and the steps I was talking about, there's about 8 of them, and each step, there's a way to prevent it at that step, so they definitely are preventable, and it just takes a united effort to do so.
I agree. I think war is often caused by religious extremists who have really, really powerful beliefs and won't let anyone get in the way of or disagree with them. So I think it's really difficult to get into their minds and really know what they're thinking. And that's how. But if we could, I think that's really how we could stop, war and atrocities and so.
Okay.
This is more or less directed to Matthew, but why do you think genocides tend to abide by those 7 or 8 steps?
Hello.
Yeah, this works. Okay. Thanks. Well, I actually found that on an anti-genocide organization's website, and I've been using it in a lot of my research, including another paper I'm writing. But they seem to follow this step just because it takes, first of all, it takes classification into different groups in order to be able to target a specific group, and then it takes the polarization of the society in order to create that hatred, and then dehumanization in order to allow the extermination stage to happen. So it takes certain aspects to create a genocide, and that's why they usually happen in these stages. But of course, everything's different, and the genocide that ISIS is doing or perpetrating is not exactly following those steps, so they're not always going to be like that.
I loved all of your guys' presentations, and I specifically wanted to ask Ava about your talk on Slaughterhouse-Five and how you mentioned I loved how you talked about beauty as a way for escapism. And I'm curious, do you think that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, or is it just what it is?
I think for Slaughterhouse-Five, I think it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He went through a really traumatic time in the war, and people who go to war often have PTSD, and they do horrible things because of it. They can't sleep, whatever. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that he turned to something so beautiful. I think that, it may not be sane, but I think it helped him, cope with everything. So I think it wasn't a bad thing, because he could have done so much worse. He could have, harmed himself or harmed someone else. So, yeah.
Okay. My question is for Juliana. I loved all of your presentations.
I thought it was really interesting. I'd never heard that point about how you say that Myrtle's death kind of symbolizes Fitzgerald's rejection of industrialization in the Valley of Ashes. I'd love to hear some like elaboration on that point.
Well, Myrtle lives in the Valley of Ashes, and that, like in the description of the book, is like very industrial, and that's what we talked about in class a lot. And so, wait, can you repeat the question actually?
I just want to hear more about your thoughts on that because I just thought that was really interesting. I never thought about that.
So I just thought that, yeah, what I said, and then I thought that when Daisy killing Myrtle was the complete rejection of industrialism. I actually didn't include this, but I included this in my paper. I thought it was really ironic, or I don't know if ironic is the right word, but Daisy kills Myrtle in a car accident, and getting hit by a car, like a car is one of the most prosperous inventions of the industrial era. So that was another point of my story, that by her getting killed by a car, by Daisy driving it, who's like so modern, so beautiful, one of the main characters of the story, that really solidified the rejection that Fitzgerald conveyed.
Yeah, I'll come. Yeah. Good work on.
I was wondering how you guys think that fear plays into this social critique, especially considering the last panel and this idea of genocide. How do you think that fear drives people to commit genocide or murder, or prevents the social critique from becoming a manifestation in real life?
Obviously fear is probably one of the most powerful emotions human beings feel, and it's really important in a genocidal regime that they monger fear among or towards the victim group. So, for example, I think in the Nazi regime, they use like stereotypes against the Jews to kind of build up a fear against them through the general public. And there's other cases, of course, where the oppressing party uses fear as a tool to turn the public against the victim group. So obviously fear, it's powerful, and if used wrong, it can lead to bad things.
I had a question for all three of you. Thinking about the role of art and literature in the face of evil and despair and anguish. I was kind of reminded of Paul Celan, who was a French poet, and he has, I don't know the quote exactly, but has said something like, there can be no poetry after the Holocaust. Like, how do we create art after something so gruesome and horrible has happened? So I'm just wondering, what do you guys think is the role of art besides critique? Like, is there something else that art and literature can do?
I think actually, like the Holocaust and other horrible things can actually inspire art. I think that's really what triggers people's emotions, and it allows for people to be even more creative because they've been through so much. So I think that can come out of such horrible experiences. It's obviously horrible. The Holocaust and everything's obviously horrible, but out of it came so many amazing stories and poetry. So,
I did not talk about genocide, but I have thought on this. Terrible events like the Holocaust and genocide can silence people out of fear and the situation that they were put in. And writing, I know for me, is very expressive. And if someone is not able to speak or loses their thoughts or mind or anything because of what they endured, writing is there to allow them to express their thoughts and feelings, and especially allow it to express them to an audience, that audience can take what they learn and be able to know what that person is thinking, because due to their situations, they might not have been able to actually say what they're feeling.
Well, obviously art is a very powerful thing. and it allows us to express our emotions and our feelings in a way that is very like profound and deep. And when I was researching the Cambodian genocide, I learned that one of the first steps that the genocidal government took was eliminating the scholars and the people who, like the professors, the scholars, professors, people who made art and had this impact on society. And also, I learned in Maya's class that some of the more recent art movements, like postmodernism and modernism, they are like kind of portrayals of our feelings in a visual form or in a written form, and therefore, like I feel that art has a really powerful effect on society, and it can be a very, very powerful tool in stopping stuff like this. So.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good note to end the panel with.
Hi, everybody. Before lunch, we have a performance. I'd like to introduce Shivani Chatterjee and Ella Ancheda. And we're just going to set up for them. I think they're going to talk a little bit about kind of the inspiration behind this song.
Hello. Hi. So for an English project last year, Shivani and I wrote a song based off the book The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And I'm singing from the perspective of Estha, and she's singing from the perspective of Rahel. And we also sent it to Arundhati Roy, and she responded, and really liked it, so that was cool.
She said
it made her cry.
Yeah, which is exciting. So in case you haven't read it, The God of Small Things is a novel about Rahel and Estha, who are two twins, and they're growing up in India, and they grow up basically inseparable. And I don't want to ruin the plot, but basically after some unfortunate events, Rahel moves to America to pursue an education she doesn't really want, and Estha stays in India, but he gets sent away basically from their hometown. And then when they're young adults, they reunite back in their hometown. And the book has a lot of commentary about how commercialism has destroyed the environment and also the culture of India. And so there's a lot of key images that we used in the song when Roy is talking about these themes. But we decided to focus the song more on Rahel and Estha's relationship because it's just the central line in the novel, and we thought it's a good way to weave in all the themes and stuff.
Oh, and it's called Pickles in Paradise because the family business is Paradise Pickles. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Is that good? Is this good volume?
Two hearts beating in time, separated by the sea. Pieces of a puzzle fit together endlessly.
In time we both return to our childhood, to our home, marked by an ugly river and grumbling blue. So
I got returned, boarded a train,
moved to New York, boarded a plane. 23 years kept apart, alone, two halves of a heart. We got frozen in time, like pickles in paradise. And then we returned back home. The watch said 10 to 2 in the History House of Blues. No more Rahel or Estha alone. No more being alone. In a temple there I saw two dancers drunk out of their minds, fighting to preserve their culture, dying on the inside.
Suddenly she felt a glow. The air inside grew warmer. In silence together, Rahel and her twin brother. Innocence gone, I lost my voice.
You were so so young, you had no choice. In a moment, everything changed. Nothing was ever the same. But we got frozen in time, like pickles in paradise. And then we returned back home. The watch said 10 to 2 in the History House of Blues. No more Rahel or Esther alone.
No more being alone. No. Our older cousin died. We were blamed, we cried. Velutha on the floor bleeding.
Childhood torn apart, we were left in the dark. But then we felt the night receding. I'll never be alone.
I'll always find a home.
It's you, yeah.
We got frozen in time,
like pickles in paradise. Then we returned back home. The watch said 10 to 2 in the History House of Blues. No more Rahel or Esther alone. You're home, you're home.
No more being alone. You're home.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. So we have sandwiches in the back. There's plenty of sandwiches for everybody in this room right now. So if you're in this room, go grab a sandwich. And presenters, we're going to meet in the courtyard in about half an hour at 12:40 for a photograph. And then we'll start at 12:45 for the next session.